introduction about her background. And with that, I'd like us to give Linda Clark a nice warm welcome.
My husband and I have been treated like coaches since we got here. So you have a wonderful program, people. They set everything up for you. Thank you all very much. But thank you all for coming. My name is Linda Clark. I'm a battlefield guide, and two of my guide friends are back there, so thank you very much for coming. They both probably remember a mutual friend. Her name was Mclean. She passed away, and she wasn't even 50 years old, and I was devastated. Our guide supervisor passed away like the same time, so that's why I started to write books. Two of my friends, it's like, I always wanted to do this. I was a library teacher all my life, and it's like, well, gee, if you want to do something, you just have to do it. So that's how I wrote my first book, and it's a fiction book, and I made up characters that might have lived in Gettysburg, but I did that so that they could talk about the real people. I didn't want to put words in anybody's mouth, so I let my little character do that. So that's why I started to write books. Well, some people said, well, we do not read fiction books. We only read nonfiction. Well, I was born in Gettysburg. I was born with a Gettysburg address. Lincoln had to wait for his. But I go to the Historical Society. I was a history nerd. I would go up there. They have notebooks and notebooks full of first-hand accounts. These were, whenever they were like 5 cents a sheet. Woody Christ copied most of these. He was one of our guide friends. And I literally just highlight what each of these residents of Gettysburg, people who had Gettysburg addresses at this time of the battle, things that they saw that were different or unique from anybody else. That's how I happened to write my books. I have 6 different books. I lost track of all my friends in my books because I had to make lists of who was in each book. I bet the one person that you all know about who lived in Gettysburg at the time of the battle was
Jennie Wade.
Jennie Wade, yes. And I'm going to tell you about her first. But then I'm going to tell you, oh my goodness, I have many, many other friends for you to meet that have amazing stories. Jennie's story got told the most. So, oh, and by the way, Tom said, of all the book titles that I have, he said, I want to hear this Close Calls. So this is for him. I redid my PowerPoint just for you. My resources, as I just said, I use first-hand accounts. Ray Coco worked at the Park Service. If you're in the Civil War, you read some of his books, I'm sure. Brazanito's books, Tim Smith. Websites. How many of you have ever visited the Stone Sentinel website? Write it down. Every monument on the battlefield is there, front, back, everything. You can still come to Gettysburg, but you can see everything. Gettysburg Daily. One of our guides used to do this on a daily basis, but it's still an archive. It's online. It has the most interesting things. At dinner tonight, Glenda was talking about Charlie Weaver at Gettysburg. Remember Charlie Weaver? Well, he had something about that. I also go online at the bottom, google.com newspapers, a free newspaper source. Now I have to admit, I find the Gettysburg Compiler, Star and Banner, and Adams Sentinel. I subscribe to the newspaper. At the time of the battle, we had about 420 structures. Houses, that number there isn't how many. It's when the first ones were laid out, the first plots of land. The Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary was founded in 1826, so you're probably familiar with the seminary buildings, the one with the cupola. Pennsylvania College, which is now Gettysburg College, was founded by that same Reverend Schmucker who founded the seminary. He needed a place to train men to go to his seminary. He founded his college. Churches. Somebody said there were a lot of churches in Frederick. We have a lot of churches in Gettysburg. Also, we're the county seat of Adams County. We have a lot of law offices. We have lots of inns because how many roads lead into Gettysburg? About 10 roads, depending on how you count. We have retail shops, and our big industry was the carriage industry. How many people did we have? About 2,400 people. Today we have about 7,000. So I thought I'd start with the first 6. Oh, you're not worried. We won't do every one. The first one I have listed is the one that everybody seems to know. And we will talk about Mary Virginia Wade, otherwise known as Jennie. We'll also be talking about her sister, usually called Georgia, but her real name was George Ann Wade McClellan. Her husband, the baby, the mother, all of those people, 1 to 5, had something in common. And that was the Jennie Wade house, which I'll show you in a moment. But look who I put at the bottom. The most important, that's you. As I study these different people and read about them, it's like there's things that you have in common with these people. Or sometimes it's like, oh, she's the age of my niece, or so-and-so is, you know, you're similar to somebody that the people long ago are similar to people that you have in your life today. So today, we have the opportunity, you have the opportunity, the responsibility to follow the sage advice that I have there at the bottom. Have you heard of Joshua Chamberlain? He said, the power of noble deeds is to be preserved and passed on to the future. So really that's the purpose of the books that I write. We want to remember not just what the generals, you can all name generals, but can you name citizens beyond Jennie Wade? And I know as a resident of Gettysburg, I'm proud of the people who lived there at the time of the battle. And hopefully you will be too. Now, I have the 2 listed there. This is Jennie Wade's tombstone in the cemetery. How many people have seen this very famous photograph? As it turns out, Jennie on the right, this is one of the only pictures taken of Jennie. This is her sister Georgia, and in the center is a neighbor. They just happened to take that picture, so after she unfortunately was killed, notice the picture that we have of Jennie Wade. They just kind of cropped it off. Jennie Wade's house, or the house where Jennie was killed, is actually the house where her sister, Georgia, lived. Georgia's husband was in the Army, in the Union Army. She was home alone. She had a baby. Talk about Planned Parenthood. Her baby was born the day the Confederates arrived in town. Not good planning. Her mother was there with her. Her sister was there with her. Now, are you noticing? This house is right here on Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill is beyond here. And the Union was on Cemetery Hill. The Confederates were in the town. The house was caught in crossfire. So as a result, it was a very, very dangerous place. There were bullet holes there in the door, as you can see. I showed this picture, though, because after the battle, notice they built houses right up alongside. On the other side, today we have a motel. On the other side, we have the parking lot, so she's kind of surrounded. The other reason I put this picture in, how many people remember those cellar doors? They had to go outside to go downstairs. There was a cannon shot that hit this building while Jennie was in there baking. The family was taking care of the baby. This cannon shot is just kind of like breaking the house in 2. The basement becomes 1 basement. Oh, I forgot to tell you. This house is a duplex. Yeah. So Jennie is killed while she's baking bread. The family takes her out the door into the cellar, downstairs. Now, while they're downstairs, who do they meet? The Katherine Mclean family. Yes, the other part of the house was lived in by Mrs. Mclean, her children, their grandfather. Mrs. Mclean had just lost her husband. Now, this is such a sad story. How many people have heard about the 1862 draft? In Adams County, many young men were drafted. This one man didn't want to go. So Katherine Mclean's husband was paid $300. Took his place. He was the substitute. He was killed in Virginia. So now Katherine and her family are in that cellar. The shells are flying, and they're there with a dead body of their sister, or their neighbor's sister. They have never seen their father's final resting place. And as it turns out, it's like this. Their father, notice his name, Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton Mclean is buried in a Virginia cemetery near where he was killed. Meanwhile, Jennie is buried right near where she was killed in the Evergreen Cemetery. The reason Cemetery Hill is called Cemetery Hill at the time of the battle is because there was a citizen cemetery. That's where Jennie Wade is buried. Many of the people that I'm going to tell you about are going to be buried there as well. Now, this cemetery, has anybody visited the Evergreen Cemetery? I know my God friends did. Take a look. The cemetery is south of town. What I've been telling you about, where Jennie Wade lived, right about here. This is part of the Union Fish Hut. The whole town of Gettysburg is going to be in Confederate hands. So we're going to talk about some of the people who live farther south of town. There's the town of Gettysburg. But we're going to be talking about people who live south of town. Does anybody recognize any of these people who had close calls? Maybe Sherpy might ring a bell. Most of them aren't, they never made the big time till tonight. Now, we're going to start down. We're talking at dinner tonight. How many people remember where Stuckey's was? Stuckey's? Come on. Okay. Stuckey's was out across from the peach orchard. And it wasn't that long ago. So we're going to start at where the blue star is. And we're going to talk about Sadie Bushman. Sadie Bushman was 9 years old. She actually lived in town with her parents. The Confederates are in the town. There are shells flying everywhere. So her parents, they think they're doing the right thing. They send her to her grandparents. This may have been her grandparents' house. There are several Bushman houses, but I thought this is probably the one you're most familiar with. I'm not sure this is the one she was heading for. But you know, it doesn't matter. She didn't make it. All of a sudden, like, she hears cannon trails in the distance. Then they're getting closer, and then there's something that brushes her skirt, and she goes down. Like the wind is kind of blown out of her. And as she tries to get back up, this man is trying to help her up. It was Dr. Lyford. Dr. Lyford was a Union surgeon. He saves her life. And he says, this is perfect, he said, that was a close call. That's the name of the book. And then he puts her to work. She becomes, at 9 years old, they call her the youngest nurse. Okay. She said at some point she had to like climb up onto the bed to help to, tend the wounds or what she had to do. Sadie Bushman is the youngest nurse. She later marries someone. They moved to Oakland, California. Wow. Other side of the world, basically. Now, while she's out there, lo and behold, she meets, this can only be in a true book. This can never be in fiction because you wouldn't believe it. She met Dr. Lyford. And Dr. Lyford remembered this young girl that did so much to help him with his surgeries. And he bought for her a house in California. So, kind of east to west. Mary Sherpy, you might have seen the sign there at the Sherpy house. This is right across from the peach orchard. Mary Sherpy was married to Joseph Shirky, Mary and Joseph, and he had bought a large piece of land south of Gettysburg. Now, we own a little land, but nobody recognizes the names of the places where we own. Let me tell you some of the places that he owned. There was this rocky place called Devil's Den. There was this little hill called Little Round Top, Big Round Top, Rocky Ridge. He owned all this on his farm, plus the peach orchard. Now, all around this house is in between the Union and Confederate lines. So they're right in the middle of things. They're pacifists. They are Church of the Brethren members. Yeah. This house, like most of the houses, are used as hospitals. One of the reasons why I used this slide design is because that red flag. If you ever drive through Gettysburg and you see the red flag hanging out, occasionally people still do that. It indicates where there would have been a hospital. Mrs. Shirky is going to be making peach preserves and all kinds of peach things as these soldiers come back many years later. And then they also talk about inside that house, they have a wall, or they had a wall, I should say, of pictures of soldiers that came back to visit. Like they had taken care of so many wounded soldiers who then came back to thank them, and they had a wall of photographs. I love this one. Josephine Miller. There's no house there now, but you would see that sign. That's a Massachusetts unit. The house was her grandparents' house, right beside that, the Rogers house. Josephine Miller, the 23-year-old granddaughter, she is in there baking. Well, Jennie baked and it didn't work out too well. Josephine is baking in her house. She's carrying water out to the soldiers. And then, as it turns out, there are going to be like 17 dead soldiers in that house. Talk about close calls. She survived. After the battle, she and her fiance, his last name was Slider. They owned the Slider farm, which was back on Big Round Top, near Big Round Top. She moves to Ohio. Many of the people who lived in these farms, they had to leave. If you're a farmer, what do you have? You're surrounded by graves. You can't farm. So the Sliders and the wife here, Josephine Miller, they're going to move to Ohio. 1886 rolls around. This Massachusetts unit that was helped by Josephine Miller, they find her. They want to thank her. So that's how this picture was taken. The house was still there. They got the little oven that she was baking in. They bring it out and they take her because they paid for her way to come back to thank her. Now, back in Gettysburg, we're going to be going from down south of town up into Baltimore Street, right about here. You might be, we're on our way up Baltimore Street. You might be familiar with this scene. It's the scene where, as you're coming out of Gettysburg, Baltimore Street over here, and then Emmitsburg Road over here. This was the Wagon Hotel. It was owned by the father of, and I love the name, Rosa Aurelia Snyder. Her brother was Esmithus and Lovencrust. They were the very odd names. So she got the odd middle name. Rosa was 4 years old. She remembers her mother baking and churning butter and taking care of wounded. How could she take care of her kids? So Rosa was told to go to an aunt's house, Susie Benner. I want you to know there is still a Susie Benner who lives in the house where the Susie Benner that she was going to. We just kind of stick around in Adams County. She's on her way to Susie Benner's house, her aunt. She hears a hissing sound. She thinks it's a snake. It's a shell that's ready to explode at her feet. She jumps away. She loses her shoe. In the book, it tells you how her brother loses his clothes. But you have to read that on your own. Her brother loses his clothes. But that's another story. This young lady is going to live to be 94 years old. And she writes in her obituary, she saw President Lincoln. This is the way that Lincoln would have processed to the cemetery. And she says, this was her quote, "He looks a lot like his pictures." Said that a little backward. Now, this beautiful house did not exist at the time of the battle, obviously. But Henry Rupp, about 38 years old, he lived there. It was a tannery. Sometimes I refer to this building as a tannery. He was the one. He was in a cellar. He has Union soldiers, like over here at Cemetery Hill. So he has Union over here. He has Confederates over here. So he is truly close calls because the shells are coming through the house. Notice that the house is no longer there. This is a rebuilt house. What I learned from him, though, he wrote about all the patriotic things that the local men and women were doing. You just don't hear a lot about that, but some of the various groups that they joined as 1861 and Lincoln had the call to volunteer. So he talks a lot about that. Does this one make you hungry for ice cream? This is where Mr. G's ice cream is now. Emma Weinberger, she lived here with her family. Her husband, whose last name was Marine, he was a seminary student. Many local girls married seminary students. At least many of the ones who write. Maybe that's a connection. She writes about how her husband is over at the seminary where he's going to school in the cupola as the battle begins. He had a very close call as shells were coming through the cupola. You can imagine what a good target that would be. The man he was there with, M.L. Culler, C-U-L-L-E-R. What does the M.L. stand for?
Martin Luther?
Martin Luther, yeah. Good old M.L. Culler, Martin Luther Culler. Thank goodness for him because he was going to be here with the Weinbrenner family in this house during the battle. They have amazing experiences, the house getting hit by shells, but their most amazing experience is there's a knock at the door. It's getting dark. The town is in rebel hands. They have rebel sharpshooters in the house firing at neighbors that have Union sharpshooters in the house. They answer the door. There are Confederates inviting them to dinner. They invited them around back in some building, a little stable, I guess, and they had a chicken dinner. She talks about like they pulled the chair out. The Confederates doing this for the citizens against them. These are the stories you don't hear about when you read about the military. This house also has a restaurant in. You probably recognize this as the Farnsworth House. At the time of the battle, Harvey Sweeney lived here. Now, poor Harvey Sweeney, by the time he was 22, both of his parents had passed away. Most of his siblings, by the time he was 51, when the battle started, his wife left, took the daughter. His one son said, "Hey, you're a rebel sympathizer," which really hurt him. And then his youngest son left home, moved to the Midwest, becomes a soldier, joins the military. Actually, he's underage. He lies about his age. Henry Sweeney goes out and tries to talk him into returning home. And then in the book, it has like the letter, the obituary actually. The son is accidentally killed by one of one of the other men in his unit, an accidental firing of one of the guys. So he loses his son. Now he's in his house all by himself, except the people who live out on McPherson's Ridge, they had to leave there. So now they're coming into his house. He's taking care of wounded, and the one side of his house is totally covered with holes where his house was hit many times going down. This is my hero. Catherine Garlick was only 41. Now maybe she aged that much after her 3 days at Gettysburg. She lives, well, this is kind of funny. The house that she lives in, I know when I was a kid, I had people who their last name was Garlick, and they were in school with me. My mom's 93. She had people that were Garlick that went to school with her. Garlicks lived there then. I knocked at their door to put a sign in their window. I talked to Mrs. Garlick, and that was just a couple years ago. So, just in recent years, it's now out of the Garlick family. Now, this is Garlick. The picture that you see there, she has a pig pen or something. The story is a little vague. It's told many ways, but back the little alley beside the house, she's got to be taking care of her pigs. You have to feed the pigs. Well, while she's back there, apparently she finds a General Schimmelpenning, and he's under a wood pile. She continues to feed him, so he's not captured, and the pigs, and taking care of her family. The house is at the bottom of the hill, bottom of Street Hill, which wouldn't be a problem. But think about all the rain we've been having. She had water in the basement. It was a big problem because where did the citizens go to stay out of the fire? So luckily, her husband had been a carpenter. She goes back, gets wood, builds a platform down in the cellar where she keeps her family and other families out of water. Her daughter writes about her mom. There's a Confederate coming into their house. He's got to go upstairs and use that window like to shoot at Union soldiers on Cemetery Hill. That woman. She goes up there and pulls at his coat like, you are not going to use this house that has women and children for that purpose. She was no wit. Also, though, she writes after the battle. We talk about fake news today. She complained about fake news because there was a newspaper reporter in New York that really trashed the people of Gettysburg. I mean, that's what he did. And her husband, he had left the house. I mean, you couldn't go on GPS or Google Earth or, you couldn't turn on the TV. How are you going to see what's happening? He went up to Cemetery Hill. Well, then he couldn't get back. So she didn't know if he was dead or alive, so she was very upset with the way the men of the town were treated. Now, this house you might drive by many times and never notice. It's on Baltimore Street. Here beside that beautiful window, there is a cannon shell. Remember, our cannon shells aren't that huge. We had the light artillery. This house has a new facade. It didn't look like that at the time of the battle, but Reverend Bergstrom, a Methodist minister, spent 1 year in Gettysburg. Guess which year it might have been? His daughter talks about being upstairs, taking care of her brother who has typhoid. You kind of forget that these people have other daily health problems to deal with that, and now the Confederates are in their town. She says a shell came through the front window, bounced off the wall, and went back into the street. And for some reason, she writes out, she went running after it. And she ran across the street, and there's a Confederate over there, and he said, you're no better off here than where you were. You might as well go home. Gates Fonostock. I love some of the names. This is right across from the Fonostock building that's a pretty famous photograph. Gates chances are, no matter what they're doing, they're bored. But most of the 10-year-old boys in town, and a lot of them did do writings at some point in their life. He said, boy, when those Confederates came to town, it was like a Wild West show. He loved it. They were going up and down the streets on their horses, shooting their guns. He thought it was the greatest thing. The one thing he does say then later is, his closest call was on July 4th. That's the day after the battle. Now keep in mind, we know, when the battle basically ended, but there were Confederate sharpshooters. He was out trying to clean off the sidewalk, and many times they talk about mud and blood. Like we talk about the hurricanes, which are awful. We look at all that mud. In addition, here we had huge storms after the battle, but we also had the blood and the mud. And as he's cleaning off his sidewalk, a bullet comes right by his head. So that was his closest call. Now, we're heading, kind of come up the street. Okay, we've done Baltimore Street. We're going to come up to the center of town and go out to the right, for sure. I put the diamond in there because at the time of the battle, instead of being called Lincoln Square or Insanity Circle, for anybody that's not around there, they called it the Diamond. Because you think if 4 roads come in right there, they kind of form a diamond. Oh, I forgot. Look at this. That was in the center of the town. That was our first courthouse. Not at the time of the battle, but from 1800 to about 1858, that building stood in the center of the town. Can you imagine appearing in court? That would be taking your life in your hands, maybe. Now, as you go down York Street, Valentine's Slopping had a bakery. Now, this was a very controversial thing, a bakery. Who usually did the baking? The women. Why should we have somebody else bake? So you can see it was kind of this is a newfangled idea. He was all right, but his business took a big hit because Confederates took his bread, and then the U.S. government, they had a contract. He was supposed to supply bread to all of the wounded soldiers at the courthouse. He never got paid. Now, I'll be honest, you can look through these legal documents. They just went on and on and on. So he never really got money. I found this. Does anybody remember Henning's Bakery? Where's my Glenda? Yeah. Do you remember Henning's Bakery? It was there on York Street. It closed in 1971. I remember getting cookies there. But the point is, there was still a bakery there that many years after the battle. So that's a picture from 1971. You may have passed by the St. James Church. St. James Church, their reverend at the time was Reverend Essex. He was an amazing man. This is a newer church, not the one that was there at the time of the battle. Reverend Essex, he was up in the steeple, and the bullets, after he left, it's like, oh my goodness, like there were bullets all around him. Now, his diary, I found his diary online. His wife had passed away about 3 years earlier. It was right before Christmas. And the way he wrote it, these people were such amazing writers. He said, and as she gave birth, and our son breathed his first breath, she breathed her last. And then he talks about his grief. But then you think, like, that's one person. In Gettysburg, in 3 days, we had 7,000 to 10,000 dead soldiers, which is more than we can really imagine. Reverend Essex also talks about he uses a word that I never heard used in Civil War. He said a lot of the local people were depressed. He said a lot were depressed. And he talks also about the Confederates running up and down the street. Now he says, see this just goes to show you, depending on who you ask, he said that the Confederates were very mean to the people, the residents. Like we had a totally different story right up the street. I remember when this house burnt. This was the Globe Hotel. John Will and his dad, they had an inn there. They recall when the Confederates came into town, it's like, hey, those guys look familiar. They think that some of the Confederates that were entering Gettysburg in July of 1863, they remember serving them. And they remember these people coming and asking lots of questions. Well, how do you get here? Well, how do you get there? Sometimes these guys, John Will and his dad, are referred to as perhaps Southern sympathizers, but it depends who you believe. John Will, he's a young man. He talks about going up on the top of the house, behind the chimney, so he can see what's happening. He's almost hit. And this Confederate yells at him, like, get down, get down. And it took him a while to realize he was talking to him. And this young Confederate soldier says, I almost shot you. You're a civilian. I shouldn't shoot you. And these two young men, I can just kind of imagine them talking. What John Will writes is, if 12 of the most extreme northern people and 12 of the most extreme southern people got together and were hung before the war, there wouldn't have been war. That's what it said. An interesting concept. Yeah. John Will also talks about how Confederates going in there, it was an inn, a tavern. The Confederates wanted whiskey. And Father said no. But then there was this saber that appeared. They got the whiskey. Back in the center of town. Going to be going down Chambersburg Street. And we're going to talk about some near misses. I don't know if any of these names look familiar or not. Chances are no. But they got some quite exciting stories. Hugh Scott. He was a young man. His dad. What did I do? Well, this Hugh Scott had a telegraph. He was operating a telegraph. Can you imagine how important that piece of communication was to keep that going? Well, as it turns out, he finds out that the Confederates are right at the edge of town. His family helps him load up his equipment. He goes out the back door in the alley, in a buggy, off he goes. Moments later, his mom and aunt go to the front door. There's a knock at the front door, and they're met with a gun to their head. Of course, it was meant for Hugh. And the mother, they didn't lie back then. The mother said, and I told a lie. I said, oh, you left 3 hours ago. And then she tried to get rid of any of the writings that he had done. But Hugh Scott, and this is there where the Parrot restaurant is. Marion Moore. She lived where the Thai restaurant is. A few years ago, the YWCA, I don't think I brought my. We worked together and we put signs in the windows. If you walk around Gettysburg, you might have seen it. It's called Women Behind These Walls. And we write a little bit about what the women were doing, what their experiences were. Well, I got to go into the Thai restaurant and explain to them why they should put this sign in the window. It was interesting. But they did, it's there. But in any event, Mary Warren, she had lost a child, so like she knew about grief. She complained about the government. She said the government did not sufficiently fortify our boundaries between North and South. I thought that had kind of like a current ring to it there. She's complaining about that. She tells an amazing story. Like the cannonballs are hitting the house, and her house would be to the kind of one way over on the left. They decide it's not safe, so they go to the bank, to the safest place in the bank, a vault. 19 women, 2 dogs, and a cat. Can you imagine? They survived though. And later she talks about, and this is something that you never hear about in military books, many of the people who lived in town, they have Confederates right outside their windows. What they keep hearing, and this was more than one, they keep hearing they're going to raise a black flag over the town. They're going to shell the town. And this was heard by a number of the sources I have. She also talks about, oh my goodness, the flies. She needed that black flag stuff afterwards because the flies were incredible. But one of the most, just kind of picture this. The Confederates had built some kind of an embankment across the road for protection. After the battle, what's happening to all these horses that were pulling the cannon? They're just kind of wandering around. I'm sure everybody was truly shell-shocked. So now, she says, and these horses start down the road. They get to my house. They're too tired to go over. They're too tired to go around this embankment. She says, they walk right down the hallway, right through my house. There were wounded soldiers on either side in the rooms. They just walked right through. And then, apparently the back porch had been hit, so it probably wasn't really level. So they get back there and they're kind of slipping and sliding. And she said, good God, what happens next? And you know, we have the 20/20 hindsight, and we know that things eventually get back. That was her story. Jennie McCurry lived across the street. I book has 2 letters. The information I got from her, she wrote in letters to her relatives. One before the battle, she was all upset about these ditzy little things that we all worry about. You know, oh my Lord, what's going to happen? And then after the battle, she writes about, you know, real issues that she has to deal with. And this young lady also was up on the roof watching the battle. I thought it would probably be mostly the guys that she was up there. Now, Amos Weston, has anybody ever heard of him? Not a famous person. He was a 25-year-old student at the seminary. And he was living in a boarding house near where Mary Warner lived, there on Chambersburg Street. And he was telling his neighbors, you better be careful, you better be careful. Well, here about that time, he said he was hit in the leg. Now, some of these, if you go to newspapers, some of these events did make the newspaper, like somebody get shot in the leg. He went on to become a minister, and he would hand out a calling card, wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. I love Margie Gould. She did not live in this building. Does anybody remember this? It's burned in the 1960s. See, I really am older than them. We decided I took the guy test with a crayon. Margie, right here, she lived over here, beside this big building. This big building might not have looked quite like this. This is the Eagle Hotel. She lived here. Her dad had a candy shop. she remembers the Confederates coming into town, and she recalls it was recalled in her obituary that she was carried to safety by Confederate General. I don't know, apparently somebody probably told her that. Frederick Layman, what do you think of that? Now, this was a 15-year-old student at Pennsylvania College, which was now Gettysburg College. He felt very patriotic. He said that he was inspired by what was happening. So, he goes out and he gets one of the weapons from one of the soldiers who has been killed, and he's going to join the battle. He's almost captured. He goes back inside, and then on July 4th, he is also hit in the knee. And he said that he was crippled for the rest of his life. But he went on to become a lawyer in Washington, D.C. You know this one. John Burns. Now, on his, this man, at the time of the battle, was 69 years old. He went out to fight off the Confederates. You hear these Confederates are coming into his town. He has a statue out on the first day's battle where it says he is 70. But that is not right. He was very upset that whenever the Union commander of the Iron Brigade, who he was fighting alongside, they said he was 70 years old, and it really upset him because 69. And so any of that, he's the only civilian who went out to fight off the Confederates, although many other local men were involved in other military efforts other than Gettysburg. Now, chances are you've driven by this church. Saturday nights, they have a beautiful service here. And Elizabeth Butler did not live on this street. She was an African-American woman. Of the 2,400 people who lived in Gettysburg, we had about just under 200 African-Americans. Many of them had just moved up over the Mason-Dixon line. They wanted freedom, and they wanted their kids to have an education. This lady worked for Albertus McCreary's family. And Albertus, again, a young boy, he remembers seeing on that street in front of that church his maid, Elizabeth, and a group, it doesn't have a number, a group of African Americans bound and gagged by the Confederates. This was before the battle, the end of June. And then, on the right, it says there was a distraction, there was confusion. It doesn't say what it was. Something happened. Elizabeth gets away, runs into the church, and hides up in the cupola. She survives. But she talks about there were many missing faces in her community. And again, we don't have numbers, names. Not yet. Tim's probably working on that. Now, going around the corner, the Michael Jacobs house, this whole family. Michael Jacobs was the college professor who lived there who walked to work July 1st. He had an 8 o'clock class to teach. So what? There's a little bit of activity west of town. Of course, he cancels his class a little early because things are getting a little wild. They're not paying attention. But then he also has a son that writes a lot about what happens here, including the daughter. They had a daughter named Julie. On July 4th, again, after the battle, she stood right there. Now, out in this direction, Seminary Ridge, Confederates had been left behind. They were sharpshooters. They were firing down Middle Street. Union soldiers were kind of staggering in from Cemetery Hill. As they crossed the street, they'd be killed. And Julia couldn't stand to see anybody else killed in her front yard. So she stood there. Her brother said she she was a human warning system. And of course, she attracted fire herself, but she was not killed. But she was a very brave lady. And then the Katherine Foster house, it's funny. I had talked about Katherine Foster in a previous book, so I wasn't going to put her in this one. One of my friends said, "Oh my gosh, Debbie," said, "this house was hit more times than any house." And truly, the young lady, or she wasn't quite she was actually a spinster. She was at least 40. And she was standing on the back of the house, the balcony. And that would overlook the first day's battle. She has cannon shells going through her skirts. Then, parts of the house were hit by cannon shells, like they were feeding surgeons in the house. The wall came down right after the surgeons got up from breakfast. Her father, 79 years old, he said that he didn't mind feeding the Union soldiers. He did that. But he said, "Boy, if those Hessians come in here," he said, "I'm going to make a pie out of them." Well, they did come in. And the one put a gun up to his breastbone and demanded $50. So how many people in here could come up with that $50? He couldn't. He found 3. And they took it and he survived. A close call, for sure. Now, making it to the tragic hits. We talked about Jennie Wade. But chances are, you never heard of some of these other folks. Now, I kind of broke the mold because Horatio Howe is not, he didn't have a Gettysburg Address. But he was standing there on those church steps on the first day after the beginning of the battle. He was a chaplain with the Pennsylvania unit. He is in there, he's taking care of wounded. Now, as the Confederates force the Union back on the first day, he hears this commotion. He wants to know what's going on. He comes to the top of the step. They call him, and he was dressed in he was a chaplain, but he had more or less a military garb. And he was ordered to surrender his weapon. He said, "Oh no, I'm a chaplain." That's pretty much all he said. He was shot and killed there on those steps. Alan Fraser. He was a poor soul. He was only 14 years old, and he was an orphan. So this family, this Solomon Powers family, took him in. They're taking care of him. They're also, boy, can you imagine when Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg in November, how many people came to that dedication? They had so many people in their house, and the one was this Mr. Briggs from New York. He had lost a son at Gettysburg. His son was buried out in the cemetery that Lincoln was going to dedicate. So he goes to that dedication, he finds a shell. He brings it back to the Powers house. Now, there was a porch of some sort at that point. And he's hitting the shell when it explodes. His hand is amputated. Alan Fraser, they say, was cut in half. But again, you never heard of him. James Cole lived in a house that was right here, beside the courthouse. The courthouse, this one was here at the time of the battle. Right here where James Cole lived. Remember I said these teenagers, they were bored. He was a teenager. So they're going out finding these shells. They want to make a little money. And his dad said, "Don't do it." Well, he did it, and he was messing with powder, and he was killed sometime after the battle. We don't know. There were definitely African Americans who lived there. George W. Sandon, before the battle, Confederates came into Gettysburg. commander said, hurry home, hurry home. Well, on his way home, as he's jumping a fence, his horse falls, he's shot and killed by a Confederate. Down on Baltimore Street, or Baltimore Pike. This is his marriage picture, his wedding picture. One of the neighbors found the body and had to go tell his wife that her husband was killed. But you never heard of him either, I bet. And then perhaps saddest of all, we talk about brother against brother, the Civil War. Well, Edward McPherson Woods, Mr. Woods, his dad, was a soldier who fought under a group under the command or founded by this man, Edward McPherson. You've heard of McPherson's Ridge. Mr. Woods loved, adored his commander, so he named his son Edward McPherson Woods. Well, after the battle, you can imagine how busy parents are anyway with kids, but now they're taking care of everything. So this was truly an incident of brother against brother. It's in the paper. They don't have big headlines like we have today, but just a little heading. And it said that one brother, or Edward McPherson Woods, was shot accidentally by his toddler brother. And he is buried behind this building. The reason I have this building, the GAR Hall, if you've never been in it, anybody never been in it? Have you been in it? You come to Gettysburg. Right back here is where Edward McPherson Woods.
It's not big, it just looks up.
Hopefully you are inspired by these people that we never heard of who lived at the time. Thank you for coming out.
Very good talk. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
It still strikes me that a battle of that intensity and violence and large scale that only one civilian was killed. They're fighting right around this town. Is there anything that accounts for the low death toll, especially maybe compared to other civil
It's
war
funny that you
battles?
should ask me. I do have my books up here. When somebody was reviewing my books, they said, and the editors look at all the these people were hardy people. They followed directions. They were told to, basically they were in their cellars. They would come out, whenever they thought it was safe. But I think there was a hand of God. Truly, it's a miracle. It really is. There were so many, these were some close calls in my book, but there were a lot of people that, the Confederates, lots of people go, did they go in and destroy everything? There was a kindness, and I think the reason there was a kindness between them on both sides. Where were most of the battles? South. A lot of these people had relatives in the army down south. So, the ladies, the people who lived in Gettysburg, they're hoping that the ladies down in the south are taking nice care of their relatives. So, I think the people in Gettysburg, the one was sitting out on the front step talking to the soldiers, and I think there was a camaraderie almost. They were all in this together.
The George Washington stand-up. Have you found if there's any connection, even though he was killed, is there a connection with his family to Sandoz?
Yeah, his, one of his relatives is